So I wanted to talk about the situation with John Henry and Carey Anne related to their insurance company Loop. So there's been a lot of buzz about this recently. And so just to give a background for those who don't know, Loop was a company that was founded, I think, roughly 4 or 5 years ago. Um, and essentially, their goal was to make insurance more equitable. And so the idea was that, traditional insurance was using things that were metrics that were unfair, right? Like job titles and zip codes in order to set rates. And they wanted to actually use, direct indicators, right, of how you were driving, and then build algorithms around that, right, to determine, pricing, right? And so that was viewed as a more equitable way to handle insurance. So they raised a lot of money. They raised, I think, over $20 million, right, in 2021. But then, the company had some struggles. Apparently, they weren't able to fundraise again. And so they laid people off, and the company actually went into receivership. Um, Apparently a few months ago, and they both ended up submitting competing bids, right? Both co-CEOs, both co-founders, right? Submitted competing bids to buy the company out of receivership, and Carrie Ann's bid ultimately won over John Henry's bid. And so, John Henry has cried foul over this, right, online, and has essentially, said that the company was stolen from him. And as a result, a lot of his followers and supporters have been just absolutely torching Carrie Ann on Instagram. So if you like look at her Instagram comments, they're calling her a colonizer, right? They're saying that they hope that, the sun burns her skin off, right? They're saying that she's a white thief, right? They're saying that she's Elvis and all these other horrible things. And so I did a little bit of digging into the story, right? Because the implication is that, basically what people are saying online is that, this is a creative, black person whose ideas were stolen, right? By kind of, by a white person, by the system. And so I did some research on Carrie Ann. Apparently, first of all, she graduated from MIT, so she's an MIT grad. She studied public policy at MIT. And one of the things that I found out when I was looking at her resume is that she's been in this area of like trying to use public policy for good since 2008. So that's nearly 20 years now that she's been in this area of trying to use data, right, to help people who are formerly incarcerated or homeless or whatever the case may be, to drive these social equity causes. And she's 38 now. She's been doing this since 2008. And so, this is essentially her life's work, right? This is what she's been working on her entire adult life. And I found a podcast, right, from a few years ago where John Henry and her were being interviewed about how the company started. And in that interview, John Henry says that basically Loop was Carrie Ann's idea, right? So he was at a conference that she was at, and she was basically presenting, right, the core for what became Loop. And so she is the one who came up with this idea, right? This is her life's the culmination of her life's work, and she brought him on later. And so the idea that she came in and stole a black person's work is seems unfair, right? When you look at the history. And she's the person who she understands data science, right? And so if you look at her skills on her LinkedIn, she understands, like R, right, which is a programming language for statistical analysis, right? She understands SQL, and she's been doing data science for, years and years and years, right? And so she was using that to try to build these predictive models, right, which became part of the core product that became Loop. And so I think it's important to have that perspective that she was the inventor, right? She was the technologist. She was kind of the brain behind the company. She brought in this other person later. I think it's interesting that they both had the co-CEO title, right? That tells me that they both wanted to be CEO, that they wanted to be alphas, and that nobody would back down. It didn't work, right? The business failed. And then ultimately, it appears that she decided to go it alone. And so it's a very different narrative, right? From somebody who created something, brings somebody in, and then goes ahead and tries to pursue it by themselves again, right? That's very different than somebody who comes in and steals somebody's work. And so it is a little bit disappointing to see people, immediately jump on her, right? Due to race, essentially, right? And to immediately frame this as a colonized narrative, again, due to race, without having all the information. I think that was disappointing. I think it was disturbing to see all the racist comments directed against her. Racism is ugly, no matter which way it goes. If there's racism against black people, right? When we're shopping or whatever the case may be is wrong, and racism the other way is wrong as well. And I think it's important to call out racism regardless of which way it's going, and not have these kind of double standards, right? Where you say it's acceptable to punch up, but it's not acceptable to punch down. And so I think it's important to point out. And I think it's sad that somebody who essentially dedicated, 20 years of her life to helping, the downtrodden, incarcerated people, homeless people, black people. She was doing this stuff way before John Henry was, when John Henry was, running a laundromat, right? And when he was making videos on Vice, and doing things like that. She was engaged in this work of, social justice and social equity, right? But because she's white, she's immediately assumed to be in the wrong, and she's immediately demonized. So I don't think that was fair to her. And so obviously, disclaimer, I wasn't with them, right, for the past 4 or 5 years. They've been running Loop. I don't know all the details, right, behind the scenes, and neither does anybody else, right, who's commenting on this. We got one side of the story, right, which was from John Henry, where he basically came out and accused her of being a thief. All of his followers ran with that narrative, but we don't really know a lot about the other side of the story. And so I wanted to bring some perspective, right, with a little bit of a background on her. But I'm sure that there are more layers of the onion to peel back. But I would advise people on social media to kind of withhold judgment, and to not, try this in the court of public opinion just based on what you hear from one party, right? But to look into the story more deeply, and don't just try to frame this right on the basis of, black versus white, colonizer. These are two individuals, right, who ran a company, who had a disagreement, and that's how it should be looked at.